right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to one of the last panels of the day. Unfortunately, I think we got put up against a Supreme Court panel as well, so I'm just gonna say that at the opening. So today we have what I think is actually one of the most important issues facing the United States of America and our democracy today. The title of the panel is, how do you know if your vote is counted? But really what we're talking about today is ultimately confidence in the democratic institutions that provide us the mechanisms to select our elected leaders, and the infrastructure, the systems, the processes behind that, and how they have been under duress, under attack over the last several years. So what I think I'd like to do here is first I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll ask a couple questions. One thing I'd like to do is really kind of set the context. How do American elections work? And we have a Secretary of State, we have a county level official, and then we have an election law expert. And then we're going to talk about what are the tools in the toolbox. So understanding that elections are under attack, what are the things we can do at the federal, state, local, private sector, and in the academic world to restore confidence and to boost participation and confidence in elections, and then close out with what do we see around the corner. None of these things are static. We've seen threats evolve over the last several years. And where do we see it going in light of recent developments? So we've got a real rock star panel, in my opinion at least. We'll start with Kim Wyman. Kim Wyman was the Secretary of State in Washington from 2011 to 2022. She's now the Senior Election Security Advisor to my successor at the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which for the last several years has had the designation of leading election security efforts in support of state and local election officials. A little tidbit fact about Kim is she was the last, in fact, Republican statewide office holder on the West Coast, right?
That is correct.
Yes. So we have a rare bird here. And then we have Stephen Richer. Stephen was drafted in the NHL draft in 1986. Yeah. No, sorry, that's someone else. He's a Maricopa County, Arizona recorder, just elected in 2020. He's a lawyer. He went to Loyola University, played some baseball down at Loyola, and then University of Chicago for a master's as well as a law degree, and lives in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona. And then here at the end, we've got Rick Hasen, and Rick is a West Coast, seems to have worked or attended most of the California state universities, at least for a few more hours. He's with University of California, Irvine, but as of tomorrow will be with UCLA. And he clerked on the 9th District and has an election law blog and does a whole bunch in terms of commentating. He's written a bunch of books on elections under threat. So with that, let me kind of pull it back to you, Kim, and let's talk a little bit about elections in the United States of America, how they're conducted. My theory for the last several years is one of the biggest challenges we have is from a civics education perspective, and that the average voter doesn't actually understand the processes and the machinery, the infrastructure behind elections. And it's one of those things where maybe they'll check their voter registration, but they'll vote, and then they'll turn on the TV the night of the election to see who won. But obviously there's a system of systems behind that. There's significant federal law, there's constitutional requirements. So from your perspective, as putting your Secretary of State hat back on, can you just talk to us a little bit about what's, in terms of the process of elections, how do they run in the United States in your experience?
So in the United States, we have about 8,800 jurisdictions that actually conduct the elections across the country. And they're conducted at the local level. And these local officials could either be elected or appointed. They vary greatly in terms of the scope of their responsibilities. I mean, there are some counties and city townships that have a couple hundred voters to LA County with over 4 million. So it's a very decentralized, diverse group of people that actually conduct our elections. And they all have the same requirements in each of their states, which of course each state constitution and legislature gets to write the election laws and code that they follow. And so you don't have really a federal organization that truly oversees elections in our country. And I think that's one of the strengths of our election system. It also becomes one of our weaknesses because it's very hard to standardize things. Clearly, federal law can do that for federal elections, but we certainly have seen since 2016 the challenges that come with such a decentralized system, but I still think it's a good one.
So I think, you know, that point you make about it should not be a federal process that drives elections. And I think I believed in that pretty heavily in 2020. You know, you don't want an incumbent or a participant in the election to have the ability to put the thumb on the scale. So that's important. But can you just dig into really quickly some of the different ways to vote?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. It's again, it varies by state. It really became clear in 2020 when I was Secretary of State in Washington. I had been part of our migration over about 15 years from poll site voting to vote by mail elections completely. And many Western states adopted that model, certainly in 2020. And as you move across the country and move further east, mail-in voting becomes much more controversial, which has always struck me as odd. And certainly when former President Trump took on vote by mail and said, you know, absolutely the most fraudulent way we could vote as Americans, I got a lot of calls, which was really fun. A little PTS there, actually, as I think back on it. But, you know, there are many ways that states and locals do their elections, from poll site voting on election day. We still have a handful of states that, you know, that's their main model. You have to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot, for example, which, again, I have trouble wrapping my brain around. So each state has its own different model, and most states are kind of a mix of those two things. Poll site voting might be early voting in a vote center, and of course mail-in absentee ballots as well. And the way that those ballots are cast can also vary widely. From we still have, I think, a couple states that do pure touchscreen voting, like Louisiana. You have a myriad of ballot marking devices where you use a device to mark your votes onto a piece of paper, and then of course paper ballots that many states use.
So, you know, what you highlight there is the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution provides the states and the state legislatures the ability to dictate how elections, and every state has kind of decided to do it a little bit better based on the needs of their constituents, their voters, and, you know, in some cases, particularly in Oregon and Washington, it's also the geography.
Yes.
And the wide open spaces that leads to you know, in-person voting may not be as efficient or give as many opportunities. So, Stephen, you know, it's funny, Arizona and Washington, yes, maybe they're both kind of Western states, but they actually look quite similar in terms of mail-in voting. So my understanding is Arizona has, what is it, about 80% of votes cast or by mail-in ballots or
It was 91% of the votes received in the November 2020 election were through the early ballot process, which means you either took an early ballot and you mailed it back, or you dropped it off at an early voting location.
And so you were on the ballot in 2020. So you were not in office in 2020, but you've been in ballot there, Republican in Maricopa County. And, you know, given this, you know, the similarities are worth pointing out, but at the same time, Arizona has had a bit of a departure in the sense of the disinformation that is circulated around the 2020 election. So you have been particularly outspoken in terms of the confidence you have in the processes that you have in the state, working with your Secretary of State, but, you know, at the Maricopa, you have the audit or fraud or whatever you want to call it that happened around. So what is your perspective on the way you conduct elections in Arizona? And you're out there every day talking to Arizona voters, Maricopa County voters. What are you hearing, and how do you view the threat to democracies? Again, you've been quite outspoken about where we are right now is American democracy.
Yeah. It depends how much sleep I've had. So as a bit of background, well, Maricopa County is the 4th largest county, and in fact, I think half of this room is in from Maricopa County. Yeah! All right. 4th largest county, 2nd largest voting jurisdiction in the United States. We have about 2.6 million registered voters, only behind Los Angeles County. So I'm guessing that some people who went to the Supreme Court won, it's because they have so much confidence in the election system already. So the Aspen Institute, check. Just out of curiosity, who here has confidence in election administration defined broadly? Okay, so here we're pretty good. But we're looking for the people who are not raising their hands. And we're looking to speak to those people. Yeah, there's lots of people who we're never going to convince. but we're looking for the people who just need more information. And that's really what election officials have learned, and we're playing catch up. Because prior to about 2016, 2015, nobody gave a darn. Don't make me wait in a line, get my results to me faster, see you again in 2 years. But really, we've learned that there is a large appetite for election information. And so I hear you, I see you, I tried to speak to those people. As Zoe Chance said in a previous position, or a previous panel, help us out a little bit. You know, tell us, what can we do to convince you? Because we really are trying, but we're trying with the methods that we know. We're trying with lots of informational handouts. We're trying with videos. We're trying with tours. We're trying to let you track your ballot all the way through the system. You can get on text message if you're in Maricopa County, and you can get text alerts at every stage of the ballot. In Colorado, you can go online and you can see images of all the ballots cast. So we're trying to become more transparent as an industry because we have realized that there is this need, and really, I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a priest, so for those of whom it is a matter of faith, you know, I'm sorry, but we're trying to work with the people for who we just need more information. And so information, and elections departments have become every bit as much a communications department as they have become administrative departments. So not only is it about building the mousetrap, making sure the mousetrap works, but explaining how the heck the mousetrap works, and such that it's not just switching votes back and forth.
So that's actually been one of my biggest observations over the last 4 years, is that shift from just getting the thing done, conduct the elections, get through the process, to now the real need for strategic communications, community level engagement. I was always a big advocate for the equivalent of a schoolhouse rocks. Like, how do we vote? How does the system work? You know, we have to get to that level of communication once again to explain the processes to restore confidence. Now, so what we've heard is, you know, how elections work, some of the things that we've seen on the ground in Maricopa, but you know, Rick, step back for a little bit, for us for a little bit. The last 4, 5, 6 years have been remarkable in terms of the narratives that are circulating that are seeking to undermine confidence. So from your perch, what's been that main shift in the information landscape around elections? You wrote a whole book about this, so walk us through this a little bit.
Sure. So when you think about how people get information and how they know what's the truth, we are just in a fundamentally different environment than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago. So if you want to know what the truth was, you watched Walter Cronkite on TV or you read your local newspaper. One of the claims I make in my book, Cheap Speech, is that if we had the polarized politics of today, but the technology of the 1950s, we wouldn't have had the events of January 6th. And we wouldn't have 59% of Republican voters believing that an important part of what it means to be a Republican is to believe that the 2020 election was stolen. So when you have this different information environment where the intermediaries who help tell the truth are undermined, then it becomes harder for voters to know what's true. And so you think about who Donald Trump attacked from 2015 when he really comes on the political scene through today. He attacked the press as the enemy of the people, the opposition party, his own party, the FBI, the judiciary, right? These are all the institutions that we use to tell the truth. And, you know, according to a New York Times count, between November 3rd and November 23rd of 2020, Donald Trump went to Twitter 400 times to make claims about the election being stolen. And he could make those claims directly to millions, tens of millions of people without a filter. If Donald Trump in the 1950s would go to the podium at the White House 400 times, it would not be reported in an unmediated way. And so we have to think about what strategies we can use to help voters get reliable information. One of those is to make sure that people can find the actual official information. And so social media companies giving blue check marks to the registrar, that's an important step. But it's going to take a lot more, because it's not just nobody knows what's going on and it's hard to know what the truth is. There are actors, both domestic and foreign, who want to interfere with our elections, who want to undermine our democracy for either political purposes or financial purposes, and we have to figure out how to fight back.
So one of the things that I've said before, and I may have stolen this from either Matt Masterson, who worked for me at CISA, and we all know well, but when you don't understand how anything works, everything looks like a conspiracy theory. Now, yes, that's a little bit, maybe a little aggressive, but nonetheless, it speaks to the need for that strategic communications piece and unpacking the black box that sometimes elections and election equipment and machines and the systems around them get accused of being. But let me just do a really quick kind of like lightning round, and I'm gonna spring this one on you. But and what are the effects, right? What are the impacts from, in your view, from election disinformation? I mean, it could be anything from voter suppression, suppressed turnout, lack of confidence in the process. What are the biggest threats to election outcomes and participation as a result?
People don't believe the results, and they lose confidence in it. And I've been in this long enough to have been through two very high-profile controversial elections, 2000, the presidential election, and the closest governor's race in the country's history. And the only thing I can tell you about both those elections is that half the country or half the state believes that the elected person won, and half the country believes the election was stolen, all these years later. And that's what's at risk, and I think we are in a different era now because of social media and the instantaneous information exchange that these series now can grow into things that really make people believe that it was a rigged election, and I worry about the future.
I mean, it's kind of that thought of, and I'm sure, Stephen, you've heard this, but it's like, why should I vote? My vote doesn't count. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, on some of those days, I'm like, okay, don't. I've tried my hardest. I absolutely don't believe that. What has it had? Lightning round from Arizona, I don't really know what the substance is coming from the sky, so I think it's associated with lightning. We might see a change in voting behavior. I think we've gone from a state in which Republicans actually dominated mail voting. They did very, very well, and Democrats did better in in-person voting. I think we're going to see a flip for the foreseeable future in Arizona. I've also already delivered on a non-campaign promise, but campaign promise that other people make, is we have this giant black wall and fence around our tabulation center now. So I have built the wall already in 1.5 years of my term.
Sorry.
Is that going to be your campaign motto in 24?
For some that would probably do better than saying other things.
So Rick, as voters themselves, they voice their concerns. How does that affect state legislatures? What are the outcomes there?
Well, I think the first thing to think about is that what saved American democracy in 2020 was that Republicans and Democrats who had crucial positions in elections were heroes. You were a hero. You were fired by the president for saying that the election was not stolen.
It's true.
It was Brad Raffensperger who didn't find 11,780 votes, a Republican Secretary of State in Georgia. It was Stefan Bibas, a Third Circuit judge, who said, you can't come to us and say that the Pennsylvania election was stolen without presenting actual evidence. Unfortunately, many of those heroes will no longer be in a position of power. And we're seeing people who are election deniers running for office.
Yeah.
And you mentioned state legislatures. Here's the problem. The base of the Republican Party believes the last election was stolen, and they want to elect people who will parrot that line and who are going to be running elections next time. Let's imagine those people some of them are in positions of power and they run the elections fairly. Are people on the left side of the spectrum going to believe it was fair, even if it was fair? So it's kind of a double crisis of confidence. And so state legislatures are passing laws that are reacting to Trump from above and the Republican base from below, saying there are problems with elections, and there really aren't problems with elections in most places. And in some places, these laws are making it harder for people to vote, and the Democrats have an incentive to exaggerate how much harder it is to vote, and it becomes a vicious cycle. I've long called it the voting wars. I feel like things are getting worse rather than better in terms of the ability to find bipartisan solutions to actually run elections in an effective and efficient way.
Yeah. Can I pick up on that?
Sure.
Because I've run 5 elections so far. jurisdictional elections, and in those elections, I have seen no evidence of significant voter fraud, and I have seen no evidence of significant voter suppression. And yet, 97% of the conversation in election administration at the state legislature is regarding one of those two topics, and both are, I don't think, substantiated by the facts.
So I think the key to a effective panel like this is you spend the first half scaring the hell out of people and the second half talking about solutions. And I think sometimes we forget to talk about solutions. And I think that's a key part for this conversation. What are the tools in the toolkit for building confidence, restoring confidence in elections, assuming there was some at one point, but looking forward, what has been effective over the last several years, if anything, and what do we think we have to put in place with the midterms coming up, with all the various statewides that are coming up in November, with 24, 24 and the primary season is going to be here before you know it. And don't forget that election conspiracy theories do not just circulate around the general and the November race. If you remember, it was the Iowa Democratic caucuses. They used an app that crashed throughout the process, and there were claims that it was some sort of manipulation. Meanwhile, all the votes were cast in public, and it was not a secret ballot. So everything's kind of on the playing field. So Kim, you're now with CISA, which we worked on from 16 to 20, and now you've continued that tradition working with state and local officials. What, from your view, are some of the key accomplishments or objectives that you have to achieve for 22 and 24, and what is needed most at the state level from the federal government, and I mean both the executive branch and, if you can, the legislative branch?
It's big.
I can take the legislative branch if you need to.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I think going back to that 8,800 jurisdictions, the biggest challenge that I think we face as a nation is if you're Maricopa County, you're LA County, you're King County in Washington, you're well-resourced. You have hundreds of employees, you have an entire, you probably have a CISO, you have an IT department, you have the resources. You get into those medium and small-sized jurisdictions, they're lucky if they have an IT person in their county, let alone someone in their elections division. And it's amplified by the challenges of funding for elections. Yeah. So the first thing I would say is funding for elections, especially at the national level, because it's an uneven playing field. And I can tell you, as having been a county auditor, a counterpart to Stephen and Secretary of State, if I have to convince my legislative body to put an election deputy in my office or a sheriff's deputy, I can tell you who wins. And it's usually not the election deputy. And so if you are in a jurisdiction that's well-funded, you are going to be able to battle the foreign and domestic adversaries that we have in the cyber world, the misinformation, the comms plan. If you are in that small to medium size, it's a bigger challenge. So I think that the good news story here is the work that Chris did at CISA that predates me, and Matt Masterson and their team really did give a good foundation. So it is leveling that playing field. It is providing services like vulnerability scanning of their election equipment to see what they need to shore up and how they can do it. It's providing all sorts of resource guides and helping them do things like continuity of operation planning. And all of that work actually made the most secure election in the country's history in 2020. Even though I know that's become very polarizing, it's a fact. And I've done this work for 30 years. I can say that because I've been in the trenches and I know. And so, we were prepared for the pandemic because we did all of that preparation for cybersecurity and had all of those continuity of operation plans in place. Other things that we're doing is really just getting out around the country and talking to local election officials to see where the need is. So, we're trying to bring the resources of the federal government. Yeah, I get to say I'm with the federal government and I'm here to help. I love that, by the way. But you get to go into these jurisdictions and really find out what the needs are and help them. And so I think that's one of the things. But Congress needs to step up, and we need to have another HAVA-like funding of elections, and it needs to be sustained.
So the funding piece is pretty interesting because states and local jurisdictions have to fund, and there is a mechanism for the federal government to fund or help fund elections, but it's inconsistent, right? Mm-hmm. It's right. Authorized in the Help America Vote Act of 2003, and there have been tranches of money, but the biggest challenge I've seen is state legislatures, when they appropriate, They have very, very tight budgets. And when they see alternate sources of grant funding come in from the Fed, for the federal government, they'll say, well, you're taken care of. We need to go do this thing instead. So that's that. So Stephen, shifting to you, from a DC perspective, having lived in DC for 20 plus years now, we tend to treat micro issues with kind of macro solutions. But from a bottom-up county perspective, what help, if any, do you want/need from the top? And what are some of the other mechanisms that you've seen and that you really think we need to double down on going forward?
I think more helpful from Congress would be a cultural shift, saying to your leaders and to your fellow members, this is unacceptable. A debate on a certain level is fine, but you have gone outside the parameters and you are now eroding the very edifice by which we are all imbued with our power. Instead they spent a lot of time talking about sort of the smorgasbord of things that sort of the progressive policy agenda wants, some of which were well-intentioned and some of which are fine, but it's a little bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I'm sitting there with people with a literal guillotine outside of my office and people who don't fundamentally believe in the election system, and they're talking about whether you should have early voting 10 days or 15 days. And it's like, that's, of limited value to me.
All right, so this is something maybe I'll pivot to you, Rick, on what are some of the accountability measures that we have other than the ballot box? So if we have members of Congress that continue to parrot some of the election lies, the big lie of 2020, are there accountability measures, or is it really just vote them out of office?
Well, one thing I would like to see, and I had a piece in last Sunday's New York Times, is prosecution of Donald Trump for an insurrection. We need what lawyers call specific deterrence. Yeah. That means we need to deter this specific actor from doing this again, because there's every reason to believe that he would. And we need general deterrence. So I think that's dealing with the past. But what we really need to deal with the future is we need to know that if people try to steal the election next time around, it's not going to look exactly the same way as it did before. We need to game out all the different ways this can happen. There's actually a very narrow legislative window right now. There's conversations going on among Democratic and Republican senators to pass an anti-election subversion bill. It would do things like fix the Electoral Count Act to say that the vice president doesn't have unilateral power to throw out votes. But I hope it will also do other things, like I would like to see a requirement that every federal election, and Congress has the power to override states. It's an Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution. Congress can say, you must use paper ballots. And I think that should absolutely happen. Louisiana should not be able to, and some counties in Texas, they should not be able to do anything that doesn't produce a piece of paper that can be counted by a judge. I mean, we need things that can help people know what the truth is. And transparency, some of that can come from Congress. Some of it can come from the Department of Justice.
So this is an important point, right? And Kim touched on this a little bit earlier. But prior to 2000, well, this is really in the wake of 2000 and the hanging Chad with some of the equipment that was decades and decades old. There was this infusion of money that then led to technological innovation in the way elections work. And one of those brilliant innovations was what's known as a direct recording equipment machine, where you touch the screen and the vote is registered down on removable media. The removable media is then transferred to a tabulator. Everything's counted up. The challenge is you don't have a voter verifiable paper audit trail where you can go back and do what Georgia did 3 times, meaning count the vote. So that's Rick's point about that paper ballot. And so prior to 2016, according to David Becker and the Center for Election Innovation and Research, I think it was 79% of ballots cast in 2016 election had a paper audit trail. Mm-hmm. And then by the time of the 2020, we got it up to about 95, in part due to COVID, right? The state of New Jersey flipped to entire mail-in absentee approach.
And in part due to Chris Krebs, quite frankly. I'm being serious. Like, this was something that you pushed, and in Arizona, one of the safeguards that we have, because we've been accused of deleting files, hacking the internet, is like we have a paper ballot for every single vote cast, so you can always go back and audit it, which is why when you were talking about security measures, I believe you made this like a big agenda item.
I was a big fan of keep it simple, stupid, right? So when I hear about mobile voting and blockchain coming into the voting process, I'm like, not in my lifetime, right? We need more paper everywhere so you can go back. And I got to say, Georgia and Pennsylvania were both on direct recording equipment machines in the 2016 election. They both flipped over to ballot marking devices, which there have been some vulnerabilities discovered and announced recently. But nonetheless, there were paper ballots that Brad Raffensperger in Georgia could go back and count. And it was absolutely critical in our confidence in the outcome of that election. So what I want to do is just one more maybe across the panel. But actually, Rick, just to close out on this one. So Supreme Court decides to take up next term an issue in North Carolina about the state legislature and touching on the independent state legislature doctrine. Can you unpack just really briefly for us what's going on and what the potential risks are to the voters determining American elections?
Sure, and my field, election law, is pretty arcane, but this is arcane even for people in my field. So just bear with me for a minute. So I mentioned a minute ago the Constitution has a provision. It's in Article 1, Section 4, and it says that each state legislature gets to set the rules for conducting congressional elections subject to congressional override. And there's a question, what does it mean when it says the state legislature gets to set those rules? The Supreme Court has long said that when the word legislature is used there, it means the legislative process. So there's an old case called Smiley versus Home that says when the state decides how to redistrict congressional districts, that provision that sets the district lines, that's subject to a governor's veto or signing. So that's the governor's part of it. Even though it just says legislature, the governor's also involved. There was also a case out of Arizona back in 2015 where the voters of Arizona passed an initiative that said, we're not going to let the legislature draw the lines for districts, including Congress. We're going to appoint an independent commission. And this has become popular in California, in Michigan, and other places. Supreme Court said that didn't take away the power of the state legislature. But now this issue has come back. And just this morning, the Supreme Court said it's going to hear a case next term from North Carolina. So North Carolina has a Republican legislature. It's called the General Assembly. They drew a partisan gerrymander of the congressional districts. The state Supreme Court, which has a majority of Democrats, said you can't do that. That violates the state constitution, which has a provision protecting the right to vote. Then the state legislature went to the United States Supreme Court and said, the state Supreme Court took away our power to draw these lines. And what the Supreme Court's going to decide, it's sometimes referred to as the independent state legislature theory, is whether the legislature can act on its own, even to violate the state constitution, as the state Supreme Court would say, or whether it's subject to the normal rules of the state. So why does this matter? It came up in 2020. Donald Trump and his allies were trying to use these arguments to say, for example, that the state legislature could come in after the election. There was pressure in Arizona and other places to just appoint a slate of electors, because there's a parallel provision that applies to presidential elections. Or you can imagine somebody says, a state election administrator, they didn't do the job right. They didn't do what the state legislature wanted them to do. State judge, federal judge, throw out the votes. And so it could provide a path to subvert election outcomes and shift power from all the different actors that are involved in running elections in each state to the state legislature, making them supreme. And in states like Pennsylvania and North Carolina, where you've got divided government, some branches controlled by Democrats, some by Republicans, it can lead to a lot of conflict, and that could further undermine voter confidence, because we know when the rules keep changing and people keep hearing all of this talk about fraud and suppression and changing the voting dates and the rules, confidence goes down.
So I want to leave some time for questions. So we've got a couple mic runners in the room. Anybody have questions? Because I can play off this, or... Okay. Yep, in the room, up front here, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Ava Mateo, and I actually run a youth voting organization that's focused on helping young people be informed, active citizens. And so one of our biggest challenges is helping young people be informed about local elections. And so I was wondering, is this on your radar? What role can election officials play in helping young people be more informed, particularly about the processes, but also who is running, and just what, in a space where there really isn't, it's difficult to find information about these really hyper-localized situations, what role can people like yourselves play.
Yeah, Stephen, I mean, you are Maricopa County. You're a county level recorder.
Yeah.
So what was your game plan for, youth voters?
Well, we go into any communities, we go into high schools, we go into colleges, we offer them to come here. But what I would say to you, and anyone who wants information, is election administration, as Kim can attest, is a field of underpaid people who are weirdly obsessed with this process. And so they will talk to you about it. They will talk to you about it until the cows come home. And so if you show even a modicum of interest, they're going to say, bring the whole school in. And in fact, if you're in Arizona, bring your class in. So really, the information is out there, and I would just say go to the source. And you can learn how elections work. And it's really not, the only reason it was a black box before is because nobody cared and we weren't good at communicating it. Now we're trying to get better at communicating it, but we would love if you took the first step sometimes and came in.
And then I'd also throw out, and this is a carryover, I think, from 2020, across the country, we need poll workers, we need election workers, we need people to step up and get into their local election offices and work. And that is a great way to engage young people, get them in, serving on election day or the lead-in. They'll be hooked.
If I could just add one more point about the role of social media. I think because so many people get their information on social media today, you have to be very proactive, not only as an election administrator, not only to be verified or have some kind of official recognition, but to be able to knock down rumors as they come. And so this is one of the strategic communications piece that you mentioned is so crucial, because we do know that when you hear about ballots in a ditch and you try and track the story down, by the time if election officials act slowly, that story can gain a lot of momentum.
This is a real challenge, though, right? I mean, because there are different types of narratives and themes that make themselves available to whether it's debunking or correction, and there are others that are simply either fantastical or they could in fact be true, but in the net they're not particularly significant. And that was one of the challenges we struggled with in 2020 with rumor control. So around the 2020 election, we set up a website that as certain themes came through, Arizona and Sharpiegate, there were claims that Sharpies were being handed out. They were, but they were bleeding through the paper and causing, on the flip side of the ballot, a different vote to be registered, which is actually not how it works. There were no countable areas on the other side of the ballot. So for that was one that made itself available. Say, no, in Arizona, here's the process. Here's how the ballots are configured. Here's why Sharpies don't actually matter. But other things like ballots in the ditch, and frankly, there could be ballots in a ditch. A mail truck could run off the road. And so this is where, from a voter perspective, what are the specific things a voter can do to be more resilient? Is it check your registration? We have a voter plan. I mean, what are some of the tips for voters to be more resilient?
Yeah, all of those things. Certainly, going to your local election office, finding out, making sure you're registered, making sure it's up to date, correct address is probably the most common error we have in elections. But I think it's also educating and an awareness level of where the information you're getting is coming from. And I think that the role that election officials are starting to pivot to now is, one, trying to remind people that they're the trusted sources. People are much more going to believe Stephen than me when I talk about how elections are run in Arizona, and they should be. And so, connecting with that local official as a source of information, but also being really diligent when your friend sends you, something, a post on Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Don't just like it or just retweet it or whatever. Drill down, because so much of the information out there is challenging. And I have to give a shout out, although my current boss, Jen Easterly, will probably give me a hard time about this, but one of the things that Chris did when he was at SISA is they did the war on pineapple. Should pineapple be on pizza? And we all know, of course, it should.
Nope.
But anyway, yeah. But they did this great infographic of explaining mis and disinformation and how you're manipulated by your emotions, essentially. And so, it's that kind of stuff. And the more we can make people literate, the more resilient they're going to be.
Stephen, any kind of, what are your tips from the Arizona perspective for the individual voter?
You can follow your ballot through all stages of the process. You really can. I mean, technology is starting to catch up with the election world. So right now in Maricopa County, you can go online, you can see your ballot, you can see when your ballot is fully printed, you can see when your ballot leaves the post office, you can see when your ballot has been delivered to your mailbox. You can even get the USPS informed delivery thing. Then when you send it back, you can tell all stages of the process, and you can tell when it's been tabulated, and you can go online and you can check your entire voting history, whether or not you voted. And so we are trying to make it more accessible. We're trying to get more people onto those systems. And then I would say the other thing that has changed fundamentally from 2020 is the media. There's been a lot of media bashing, and saying the media should step up here and there. And look, I'm a Republican. I'm happy to engage in some good old-fashioned media bashing. But the media has actually gotten a lot better because they learned about elections in 2020 and in 2021. And they are much better to equipped now to say that rumor that's starting to grow, that can't happen because I already know about the system that's in place. And so that the AP can nip it in the bud immediately, and I think they're going to be, yes, I'll say this, a valuable ally moving forward.
One problem, though, is voters have a harder time knowing what is reliable media. So one of the suggestions I make in Sheep's speech is that journalists should get together as create journalistic societies that give a kind of seal of approval, a good housekeeping seal of approval. If you follow these journalistic norms, like double check with 2 sources before you report something, give the person you're reporting about a chance to respond, you'll get a seal of approval, and then the social media companies can use that. So you see Arizona Republic, okay, this is a reliable source, whereas somebody creates the Arizona Times and it doesn't exist, but it has a fancy website, people would know, well, this isn't a reliable source. So we can't expect voters who are flipping through social media to have all the information at their fingertips as to what's reliable and what's not. And so the more we can help voters, give them a clue as to what's reliable information, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Oh, no. All right. So let's, I'm going to regret this later. That's my wife with her hand down. So. All right. We'll go here and then here. So, all right, why don't you go? Man, that's...
Hi, I'm Paul Leff. I'm a voter. I'm just, so 60%, you gave the statistic, 60% of the Republican Party thought the last election wasn't conducted properly. Without knowing the facts, I would guess that 60% is like Fox News's prime audience. Is there a strategy to get people like you on Fox News somehow? I mean, Fox News likes brawls, so some type of brawl between the 40% of the Republican Party that might believe something, that the last election was actually conducted properly. You have to get to that audience to actually make a difference.
So a couple of things. First, that 59% statistic was people who said that believing that claim the election was stolen was an important part of what it means to be a Republican, like believing in low taxes or less regulation. It's even higher when you ask the question, do you believe the election was stolen among Republicans?
73%.
Yeah, so that figure's higher. In the hearings, January 6 hearings, those are much more effective than I could be about convincing whether the election was stolen. There's been great reporting by CNN over the last few days about how the people who are watching Fox News goes in half when the hearings start. Half the Fox News viewers turn it off. And so what we have is not just a supply problem, we have a demand problem. People want the false claims, and that's a much harder social problem to solve, and not one we're going to solve in 57 seconds.
I've been on Brett Baier, debated Liz Harrington, Trump's spokesperson. I don't know how much came of it, but I would say David Brooks's talk last night, he said trust is more formed through these bonds, these social bonds. So I think more important than going on Fox News and telling, like, here's the 15 reasons why I'm right. I actually have more than 15. But is coming and meeting me as a person, meeting some of the elections community as a person, getting to know us, hopefully forming a bond, and then hopefully respecting our opinion as we walk you through the elections process.
All right, get us in under the line here. You got 20 seconds. So.
Okay, this is actually not for you at all, so don't worry. No, but Kim, you had brought up, like, be a poll worker, and, like, since the 2020 election, we see, like, people don't want to be poll workers because they get death threats. We saw the testimony of Ruby Freeman and Shay Mott, like, their lives are ruined. Like, how, and then maybe this is for Stephen, like, how are you going to recruit these poll workers? I mean, and that's really how elections work. I mean, if we don't have poll workers, what's the plan?
Right. Well, that's the challenge, and right now it's exacerbated, and we don't have time to talk about it. But the threats that are coming at election officials are real. They're happening across the country, and I can tell you that my colleagues are leaving in droves. The folks with the institutional knowledge of how the process works. But I'm optimistic. I like Madeleine Albright's. What did she say? She was like a cautious optimist, but
Worried optimist.
Worried
optimist. That's what it would be. I think we just keep forging ahead because it's too important.
So go ahead, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was just going to say we're going to recruit them all from the optimistic, bright-eyed,
young
new generation. Yes.
And they have to know they're protected. They have to know they're a key part of this.
And Congress can help do that too in this election bill if it does come through.
In law enforcement, speaking of general and specific deterrence, there's both available here. Those that do it have to be held accountable. I've said it before, an insurrection without consequences is just a trial run. Same thing's going here. We're developing the wrong patterns. There's negative feedback loops. So we have to hold those accountable that are doing this. You go get them and you put them in jail. So with that, all right, I want to everybody thank our panelists. They're wonderful here.